There is no cloud. When you stream a film, send a message across the world, or move money between continents, your data does not float through the sky. It dives to the bottom of the ocean. Right now, almost everything you think of as the internet is racing through a few hundred cables lying in the cold and the dark on the seabed, thousands of meters below the waves. We call it wireless, but the truth is the opposite. The modern world is held together by wires most people have never seen. Let me show you the hidden map that actually carries the internet. Start with the number that surprises almost everyone. Around 99% of all the data that crosses between continents travels through undersea cables, not through satellites. Satellites carry only a tiny sliver of the traffic. Everything else, the video calls, the cloud, the trades, the searches, runs along roughly 500 cable systems threaded across the ocean floor. Add them up, and it is well over 1 million kilometers of cable, enough to circle the planet many times over. This is the real backbone of the digital age, and it is almost entirely out of sight. Now look at what one of these cables actually is. Out in the deep ocean, the cable is only about as thick as a garden hose. Inside it, the part that does the work is a bundle of glass fibers, each one thinner than a human hair. Your messages travel down those fibers as pulses of light, flickering on and off billions of times a second, bouncing across the entire planet in a fraction of a heartbeat. The rest of the cable is just armor. Steel wire, copper, and insulation, wrapped around that delicate thread of glass to help it survive the crushing pressure and the anchors above. The cables begin and end at quiet, unremarkable buildings called landing stations, usually near the coast in places most people would drive right past. From there, the line runs out under the beach, across the continental shelf, and down into the abyss. In the deepest stretches, it simply rests on the seabed, unburied, sometimes under 8,000 meters of water. A machine no one thinks about, sitting in the darkest place on Earth, carrying the conversations of billions of people at once. None of this is new. In 1858, engineers laid the first telegraph cable across the Atlantic, from Ireland to Newfoundland. It barely worked. Queen Victoria sent a message of 98 words to the American president, and it took nearly 16 hours to crawl through the wire. Weeks later, the cable failed completely. But the ambition never died, and by the 1860s, a permanent link was carrying words across the ocean in minutes instead of weeks. Everything you are watching now is the descendant of that fragile Victorian thread on the seabed. So how does a single click travel? Say you are in London, and you load a website hosted in Virginia. Your request runs from your device to a landing station on the British coast, dives into a transatlantic cable, and crosses roughly 5,000 kilometers of ocean as light in glass, all in well under 1/10 of a second. Then it climbs back out on the American shore and reaches the server. For most of us, that speed is invisible. But for banks and trading firms, a few thousandths of a second decides who wins a trade worth millions, which is why they pay a fortune for the fastest cables on the most direct routes. This is also why satellites cannot simply replace the cables. A cable can carry an almost unimaginable amount of data, far more than any fleet of satellites, and it does so with lower delay, because light through glass on a direct path beats a signal bouncing up to orbit and back. Satellite networks are a genuine lifeline for remote places, for ships, and for backup when a cable fails. But for the sheer volume the modern world demands, nothing competes with a physical highway of glass running straight along the ocean floor. For most of the history of these cables, they were owned by clubs of telephone and telecom companies. Dozens of national carriers would pool their money to build a line, then share it out among themselves. The internet was carried by the old world of state telephone monopolies and their partners. If you had asked a decade or two ago, who owns the cables, the answer would have been a long, boring list of telecom firms most people had never heard of. That answer has now changed completely, and that change is one of the most important shifts on this whole map. Today, the cables are increasingly owned by a handful of American technology giants. Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft have gone from renting a little capacity to controlling most of it. Just over 10 years ago, these four companies used only about 10% of the world's international cable capacity. Today, their share is somewhere around 2/3. Google alone has a stake in more than 30 cables. The same companies that run your searches, your video feeds, and your cloud storage now increasingly own the physical roads that all of it travels on. Think about what that means. A small number of private corporations, answerable mainly to their shareholders, now control much of the physical infrastructure of the global internet. When they build a cable, they decide where it lands, who it connects, and who it leaves out. It gives them enormous power and enormous efficiency, because they can build exactly the routes their own services need. But it also concentrates something that used to be spread across many hands. The nervous system of the modern economy is quietly becoming private property. And here is where this story rhymes with an older one. Just like the ships that carry physical trade, these cables do not spread evenly across the ocean. They funnel through the same narrow places again and again. A huge share of the traffic between Europe and Asia is squeezed through the Red Sea and across Egypt. Another dense knot passes near Singapore and through the waters around Taiwan. The map of the internet has its own choke points, and they sit in almost exactly the same tense, crowded corners of the world as the choke points for oil and shipping. The Red Sea shows how fragile that is. In early 2024, a cargo ship in that narrow corridor was hit and abandoned, and its anchor dragged along the seabed, slicing through several cables at once. In a single stroke, it damaged an estimated quarter of the data traffic moving between Asia, Europe, and Africa. The internet did not go dark because engineers rerouted the flow around the break. But prices, delays, and slowdowns rippled outward, and it exposed just how much of the world leans on a few thin lines running through one dangerous stretch of water. Because that is the uncomfortable truth about this whole system. A cable as thin as a garden hose, resting unburied on the seabed, is astonishingly easy to break. Every year, there are roughly 200 cable faults around the world, which works out to something like 3 every single week. The great majority are ordinary accidents. Fishing gear scraping the bottom, and above all, ships dropping or dragging their anchors in the wrong place. The system is not brought down by exotic weapons. It is nicked again and again by the everyday business of the sea. When a cable breaks, fixing it is slow and expensive. A specialized repair ship has to sail out, find the fault on the ocean floor, haul the cable up from the depths with a grappling hook, splice in a new section, and lower it back down. That can take days or weeks and cost millions of dollars. And the world depends on a surprisingly small fleet to do it, on the order of only a few dozen cable ships, many of them decades old. A large share of them are near the end of their working lives, with too few new ones being built. The repair capacity of the entire planet is thinner than almost anyone realizes. Now put a hostile hand on the map, and accidents start to look like strategy. In 2023, 2 cables to Taiwan's Matsu Islands were severed by passing Chinese vessels, and the island's 13,000 residents were left with barely any internet for around 50 days. In the Baltic Sea, over the winter of 2024, ships were caught dragging their anchors for tens of kilometers across the seabed, cutting cable after cable between European neighbors. Investigators suspected deliberate sabotage. The beauty of it for an attacker is deniability. A dragged anchor can always be called an accident. Put it all together, and you get a new map of power, one that runs underneath the sea rather than across the land. Whoever owns the cables, and whoever can cut or protect them, holds a hand on the throat of the modern economy. The very thing that makes the system so efficient, concentrating the world's data onto a few optimal routes owned by a few capable companies, is exactly what makes it fragile. Efficiency and fragility, once again, turn out to be the same thing wearing different clothes. So the next time someone talks about the cloud, picture the real thing instead. Picture a bundle of glass no thicker than a hose, lying in the freezing dark at the bottom of the ocean, with the entire digital world pouring through it. That is where the internet actually lives. If you want to understand the 21st century, don't just watch the screens. Watch the cables. Next time on The World Machine, we follow the power lines instead of the data, and ask how the electricity that runs all of this actually reaches you. Sources are in the description. See you then.